The embers of the Second Punic War still glowed with a bitter hatred in the heart of Rome. Carthage, though defeated, remained a symbol of fear and a ghost of past humiliation. In the fields of North Africa, Carthage slowly rebuilt its prosperity, its wealth once again becoming a source of Roman envy and suspicion. Every loaded merchant ship was seen as a threat, every new building a defiance. An old man's obsession would become the city's death sentence. Cato the Elder, a powerful Roman senator, ended every speech, no matter the topic, with a chilling refrain. Carthago delenda est, he would thunder. Carthage must be destroyed. This was not a call for war, but for annihilation. It was a poison that seeped into the very soul of the Roman Republic, turning policy into a vendetta. Rome simply needed an excuse, a flicker of defiance to justify the inferno they planned to unleash. They found it in Carthage's conflict with its aggressive neighbor, Numidia. A treaty with Rome forbade Carthage from waging war without permission. By defending its own borders, Carthage had sealed its fate. The Roman war machine, 80,000 strong, landed on the shores of Africa. Their arrival was not a declaration of war, but the arrival of executioners. The Roman consuls, Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus, established their camp just miles from the city. They did not prepare for a siege, they prepared for a surrender. The Carthaginians, terrified of Roman power and desperate to avoid conflict, sent ambassadors to plead their case, hoping to appease the unappeasable beast at their gates. They were ready to offer anything to prevent bloodshed, to save their homes and their children from the horrors of war. The Romans delivered their first demand with cold, calculated cruelty. 300 children of Carthage's noblest families were to be handed over as hostages. The city was convulsed with grief. Wails of anguish echoed through the streets as parents were forced to part with their children, sending them into the hands of their mortal enemies. It was a wound cut deep into the city's heart, a promise of good faith secured with the most precious blood imaginable. The children were taken to the Roman camp, their cries fading as the city gates closed behind them. Yet this was not enough. The consuls then made their second demand. Carthage must surrender all of its weapons and instruments of war. Every sword, every spear, every catapult, every suit of armor was to be brought to the Romans. Believing this would be the final price for peace, the Carthaginians complied, stripping their city bare of its defenses. Wagons groaned under the weight of 200,000 sets of armor and 2,000 catapults, a testament to Carthage's former military might. As the last spear was handed over, a nervous quiet fell over the Carthaginian delegation. They had given up their children and their arms. They had laid themselves bare. Surely, they thought, this display of total submission would finally satisfy Rome's demands and spare their city. It was then that the Roman consul delivered the final, impossible ultimatum. It was a sentence spoken with the detached cruelty of a god condemning mortals. The people of Carthage were to abandon their city, their homes, their temples, and their history. They were to move 10 miles inland, away from the sea that was their lifeblood. The city of Carthage itself, the Romans declared, was to be utterly destroyed. The words struck the delegation like a physical blow. It was not a demand. It was a death sentence for their entire civilization. They had been tricked, disarmed, and humiliated, only to be told their very existence was to be erased. The Roman mask of diplomacy had fallen away to reveal the monstrous face of pure, unadulterated vengeance. There would be no peace. There was only annihilation. The ambassadors returned to the city, their faces pale with the news of their doom. When the final Roman demand was announced to the public, a wave of collective shock and horror gave way to a tidal wave of uncontrollable rage. The grief for their lost children turned to fury. The citizens realized they had been played for fools, stripped of their defenses only to be led to slaughter. The desire for peace was burned away in an instant, replaced by a desperate, suicidal resolve to fight. The people turned on those who had advocated for peace, tearing them apart in the streets as scapegoats for their horrifying predicament. They dragged the Roman envoys who had remained in the city from their quarters, subjecting them to the full force of their wrath. Every stone, every building, every citizen screamed defiance. If they were to die, they would die in the ruins of their own home, not as wanderers in a barren wasteland. The city gates were slammed shut. A declaration of war was sent to the stunned Roman camp, who had not anticipated such fierce resistance from a disarmed population. Inside the walls, Carthage transformed into a massive, frantic workshop of death. Every temple was converted into a forge, every public building an armory. The entire population, from the highest noble to the lowest servant, was mobilized for the singular purpose of survival. With no iron or bronze left, the people melted down statues of their gods and household ornaments to forge crude swords and spearheads. Production was relentless. 100 shields, 300 swords, and 500 spears were crafted each day. The shrieking sound of metal being hammered and sharpened became the city's new heartbeat, a rhythm of desperate preparation for the coming storm. In an ultimate act of sacrifice, the women of Carthage cut off their long hair, the symbol of their pride and beauty, to be woven into ropes for the catapults and torsion engines. The city's defense was being built from its own soul, from the very bodies of its people. Every citizen became a part of the war machine, their collective will a shield against the Roman legions waiting outside. The Romans, confident in a quick victory against an unarmed city, launched their initial assault. They were met with a storm of arrows, stones, and newly forged weapons. The attacks were repulsed with shocking ferocity. The consuls had gravely underestimated the power of a people fighting for their very existence. The siege of Carthage would not be a simple matter of walking through open gates. It would be a bloodbath. For 2 long years, the siege dragged on. The initial Roman commanders, Manilius and Censorinus, proved incompetent. Their legions were plagued by disease, poor discipline, and a series of humiliating defeats. Carthaginian forces, led by the general Hasdrubal the Boetharch, launched successful sorties from the city, harassing Roman supply lines and inflicting heavy casualties. The execution was turning into a protracted, grinding war of attrition. Back in Rome, the public grew restless and angry. The war that was meant to be a swift, glorious extermination had become a costly embarrassment. The Senate, facing a crisis of confidence, knew they needed a new kind of commander. They turned to a man whose name carried the weight of history and the ghost of Rome's greatest enemy, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the legendary Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. Scipio was technically too young to be elected consul, but the desperate Roman people waived the law, demanding his leadership. He arrived in North Africa to find the Roman army in disarray. With brutal efficiency, he purged the camp of its lax discipline. He expelled the prostitutes and merchants, enforced harsh training regimens, and whipped the demoralized legions back into a lethal fighting force. The hunter was sharpening its claws once more. Scipio's strategic genius immediately became apparent. He saw that Carthage was being resupplied by sea through a narrow channel into its harbor. While his predecessors had focused on the land walls, Scipio knew the city had to be strangled. He ordered the construction of a massive mole, a colossal stone and earth dam, to be built across the mouth of the harbor, cutting off Carthage from the outside world entirely. The Carthaginians watched in horror as the Roman blockade grew day by day, a stone serpent closing off their last lifeline. In a remarkable feat of engineering and secrecy, they dug a new channel to the sea from their inner military harbor. They built a new fleet of 50 ships in complete silence, using hidden materials. The Romans were stunned when this new fleet suddenly burst forth from a previously unknown exit, ready for battle. The ensuing naval battle was a disaster for Carthage. The new ships were crewed by inexperienced sailors, and their surprise attack was poorly coordinated. The veteran Roman navy, after recovering from the initial shock, shattered the Carthaginian fleet. The desperate gamble had failed. The sea, once Carthage's source of strength, was now another wall of their prison. Scipio's noose was tightening. With the harbor sealed and the navy destroyed, starvation began to stalk the streets of Carthage. The city's vast population, swollen with refugees from the surrounding countryside, was now completely cut off. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. People were reduced to eating leather, rats, and eventually the bodies of their own dead. The city was slowly being digested from the inside out. Disease followed hunger, spreading through the weakened population like wildfire. The dead lay unburied in the streets, adding to the pestilential atmosphere. The proud, vibrant metropolis had become a charnel house, a vast, open-air tomb filled with the moaning of the dying. The defenders on the walls grew weaker each day, their strength sapped by the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Despite the horrific conditions, the Carthaginians refused to surrender. Their hatred for Rome and their fear of the fate that awaited them fueled a resistance that bordered on the supernatural. They would fight until the last man, woman, and child had drawn their final breath. Surrender was not an option. There was only victory in death. In the spring of 146 BC, Scipio judged that the city was sufficiently weakened. The time for the final assault had come. Under the cover of darkness, his legions stormed a section of the harbor wall. After a short, bloody fight, the Romans gained a foothold inside the city. They had breached the outer defenses. The final agony of Carthage was about to begin. The Romans did not pour into the main streets. Instead, Scipio orchestrated a methodical, terrifying advance. The legionaries moved from the harbor towards the city's citadel, the Biasa, which stood on a high hill. This path led them through the dense residential quarters, a maze of narrow streets and six-story apartment buildings. Here, the war would become intimate, brutal, and slow. What followed was 6 days and 6 nights of unimaginable horror. This was not a battle. It was a methodical extermination, block by block, house by house. Each building was a fortress, fiercely defended by its starving inhabitants. The Romans had to take every single room, fighting with swords and daggers in the darkness, trampling over the bodies of men, women, and children. To clear a path for their troops, Scipio ordered his men to set fire to the houses behind them as they advanced. The city began to burn. The flames spread rapidly, consuming the ancient structures and trapping countless people inside. The screams of those being burned alive mingled with the clang of swords and the shouts of the dying, creating a symphony of hellish noise that echoed through the city. The streets became choked with the dead and the dying. The legionaries, advancing in their disciplined formations, paid them no heed. They used hooks and poles to drag bodies, whether dead or still living, out of their way, clearing paths through the carnage. The wounded were thrown into the fires with the dead, their agonizing cries swiftly silenced by the roaring flames. Historian Appian described the scene with chilling detail. People who had hidden in the upper floors of their homes were consumed by fire or leaped to their deaths onto the streets below. The legionaries, eager for loot, would break into burning houses, fighting over scraps of gold and silver while the ceilings collapsed around them. Greed and murder walked hand in hand through the inferno. For 6 days, the slaughter continued without pause. The city was a labyrinth of death, with every corner revealing a new horror. Scipio himself, orchestrating the destruction, barely slept. He took his meals as he moved through the carnage, a cold, detached architect of a city's demise. His only concern was the efficiency of the extermination. The Roman soldiers became desensitized to the violence, moving like automatons through the gore. They would step on the faces of the dead, their armor splattered with the blood and brains of their victims. The narrow alleyways were so filled with bodies that they formed a grotesque, pulpy carpet. The advance was slow, not because of the resistance, but because of the sheer volume of the dead. The resistance was not just from soldiers. Every citizen fought. Old men used broken furniture as clubs, and women threw roof tiles down on the legionaries below. Children, seeing their parents cut down, would charge the Romans with small knives, only to be effortlessly slaughtered. It was the death throw of an entire people, a final, futile spasm of defiance. Finally, after 6 days of this relentless butchery, the Roman advance reached the foot of the Biasa, the citadel of Carthage. Here, the last remnants of the city's population had gathered for a final stand. The streets below were silent, save for the crackling of the fires. The city was a graveyard, and only its tombstone remained to be conquered. From the smoking ruins, a delegation of survivors emerged, waving the white cloth of surrender. They were not soldiers, but civilians, the elderly, women, and children who had taken refuge in the temple of Eshmun within the citadel. They begged Scipio for only one thing: to spare their lives. They knew their city was gone, their civilization erased, but they clung to the simple, animal instinct of survival. Scipio, in a rare act that could be mistaken for mercy, granted their request. 50,000 people, a pathetic fraction of the city's original population, were led out of the citadel. They were a parade of ghosts, skeletal from starvation and traumatized by the horrors they had witnessed. Their lives were spared, but only so they could be sold into the living death of slavery. However, 900 Roman deserters, who knew they would receive no mercy, barricaded themselves in the temple of Eshmun, along with the Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal, his wife, and their 2 children. They were determined to fight to the very last. From the roof of the sacred temple, they continued to hurl insults and projectiles at the Romans below, choosing a fiery death over capture. As the Romans prepared their final assault on the temple, a shocking act of betrayal occurred. Hasdrubal, the commander who had led the city's defense, secretly slipped away from his men and surrendered to Scipio. He appeared at the Roman general's feet, groveling and begging for his life, abandoning his men, his city, and his own family to their fate. Scipio displayed the disgraced general to the defenders on the temple roof. When they saw their leader had betrayed them, they fell silent, then erupted in curses. A fire was lit within the temple. As the flames began to consume the ancient structure, a final, terrible drama unfolded on its roof, a scene that would be seared into the memory of all who witnessed it. Hasdrubal's wife, dressed in her finest robes, appeared at the edge of the roof. She did not look at the Romans, but at her husband below. She praised Scipio as a noble enemy, but then unleashed a torrent of curses upon her husband, calling him a traitor to his family, his gods, and his city. Her voice, filled with contempt and rage, carried over the roar of the flames. Then, in a final, horrifying act of defiance, she killed her 2 young sons with a dagger. Holding their small, lifeless bodies, she declared that they would be buried in the freedom of their city's ashes, not live as slaves under Roman rule. With her children in her arms, she turned and walked into the heart of the raging fire, disappearing into the inferno. The Roman deserters, inspired by her act, followed her into the flames. The temple of Eshmun became a massive funeral pyre for the last free souls of Carthage. With their deaths, the resistance was finally and utterly extinguished. The city fell silent, the 6 days of slaughter at an end. All that remained was the sound of the burning city. The fighting was over, but Rome's vengeance was not. For the next 10 days, the city burned. Scipio allowed his soldiers to loot what was left, but the true wealth of Carthage had been consumed by the flames or was buried under tons of rubble. The fires were a deliberate act of purification, an attempt to wipe the city's existence from the face of the earth. Once the fires had died down, the final phase of the destruction began. A commission of 10 senators arrived from Rome to oversee the city's demolition. On their orders, the remaining walls were torn down, the temples toppled, and the once mighty harbor filled with rubble. Every stone that stood upon another was to be cast down. This was not just destruction, It was a ritual of damnation. Finally came the most symbolic act of all, an act that has echoed through history as the ultimate expression of annihilating hatred. Roman priests were brought to the site. A curse was formally placed upon the land of Carthage, damning anyone who might try to rebuild on the haunted ground. To seal this curse, they allegedly plowed the earth and sowed it with salt. While the historical accuracy of the salting is debated, its legend captures the spirit of Rome's intent perfectly. They did not just want to defeat Carthage. They wanted to make the very earth sterile and barren, to ensure that not so much as a blade of grass would ever grow again where their hated rival once stood. It was a final, symbolic murder of the land itself, a guarantee of eternal desolation. It is said that Scipio Aemilianus, as he watched the final destruction of the city he had conquered, wept. He was not weeping for Carthage, but for the cyclical nature of history. He quoted a line from Homer's Iliad, spoken by Hector about the future fall of Troy. "The day shall come when sacred Troy shall fall, and Priam and the people of Priam of the goodly ash spear." His lieutenant, Polybius, asked him what he meant. Scipio, with a chilling foresight, confessed that he was thinking of his own city, Rome. He saw in the fate of Carthage the eventual fate of all great powers, the inevitable turn of fortune's wheel that brings even the mightiest to ruin. In his moment of ultimate victory, he was haunted by the specter of his own civilization's distant, but certain, demise. The Punic Wars were over. Rome's greatest rival was not just defeated, but had been systematically and completely annihilated. Its people were slaughtered or enslaved, its buildings torn down, its culture erased, and its very memory cursed. Rome now stood as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, its power secured through an act of genocide so total it shocked even the brutal standards of the ancient world. The fall of Carthage stands as a terrifying testament to the depths of human hatred and the ruthless logic of empire. It was a warning to the world. To be an enemy of Rome was to risk not just defeat, but utter oblivion. The ghost of Carthage would haunt the Roman imagination for centuries, a silent, screaming reminder of the brutal foundation upon which their glorious empire was built.